In the winter months of 1889, an old man lay dying in a small apartment above the sacristy of the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, St. Petersburg. His name was Dmitry Volkov, and he had served as the cathedral's master caretaker for 43 years. His son, Alexander, sat beside the bed as the old man struggled to speak. What Dmitry told his son that night was not a confession, it was a warning. He said the great domes were never built for the reasons the architects claimed. Every cathedral across Europe, every basilica, every structure crowned with those massive copper hemispheres served a function that had nothing to do with worship. He said the knowledge of what they did was being deliberately erased, and that within a generation no one would remember. Alexander wrote it all down. The journal survived, sitting now in a private collection in Moscow, largely inaccessible, but a few published excerpts tell a story that the official architectural record does not know how to accommodate. Dmitry Volkov was not an engineer, but he had spent 4 full decades maintaining the electrical systems of the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul. By electrical systems, he did not mean lights. The cathedral was completed in 1733, long before electric lighting was installed in St. Petersburg in the 1880s. What Dmitry maintained was something else, something built into the architecture itself. He described a network of copper rods embedded in the masonry of the dome, thick braided cables running through the walls down into the foundation and connections extending out into the earth beneath the floor. Twice a year, his duties required him to climb into the narrow spaces between the dome's inner and outer shells to inspect connections, clean contact points, and verify the grounding system remained intact. He used those exact words, grounding system, 50 years before electrical systems became standard engineering practice. Official history describes cathedral domes as structural and symbolic, creating interior acoustic space suited for choral music. While those explanations are not wrong, they are incomplete. The official record does not explain why cathedral domes across Europe from the 1600s through the early 1800s were built with such identical technical dimensions and extensive metalwork. St. Paul's Cathedral in London, Les Invalides in Paris, the Berlin Dom, and St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg all share a specific design vocabulary beyond mere aesthetic preference. The outer shells are copper or lead, the inner frameworks are iron, and the peak of each dome is crowned with a metal lantern or cross, often gilded, always conductive, and connected to an intricate grounding network. Dmitry's journal describes his work in precise technical detail, including measuring the resistance of the ground connections using a galvanometer. During thunderstorms, his supervisor instructed him to verify that the dome's grounding rods were making clean contact, because if they were not, the electrical discharge could damage the interior stonework. He used the word discharge, describing an active piece of infrastructure rather than a passive piece of architecture. In the late 1700s, before the electric grid existed, an entire branch of science was devoted to atmospheric electricity. Pioneers demonstrated that an elevated, pointed metal rod could draw electrical charge from the air, even without a thunderstorm, tapping into the natural energy of the heavens. By 1750, lightning rods were being installed on churches across Europe, but these were not simple spikes. They were elaborate branching systems integrated directly into the architectural metalwork. The dome of Les Invalides in Paris, rising 107 meters, was clad in gold leaf, which is an excellent conductor. The Berlin Dom featured a gilded cross rising 98 meters, connected to copper cables that were systematically inspected and replaced on a scheduled regular basis through the 1800s. The core of this perspective is that the great domed cathedrals of Europe were part of an atmospheric electrical infrastructure that modern science has largely forgotten because the technology was abandoned before it could be systematically documented. Architecturally, the structures maximize height to capture the potential difference between the negatively charged Earth and the positively charged upper atmosphere. This potential difference exists even in fair weather, meaning a tall, conductive metal dome connected to an extensive grounding network would constantly facilitate a subtle flow of electrical charge. What did this continuous flow actually accomplish? Dimitri's journal contains a passage describing what he called the hum. He wrote that on certain clear, dry winter days, when the wind came from the east, you could hear a low vibration inside the dome if you stood at the center of the cathedral floor. When the hum was present, the air inside the cathedral felt different, sharper, and cleaner, a description that aligns precisely with the effects of negative ionization. A gilded spire elevated 100 meters in dry air would produce a corona discharge ionizing the air inside the massive space. Dimitri also recorded that the hum disappeared after major alterations were made to the building. In 1881, the cathedral administration ordered the removal of several original copper grounding cables during a renovation of the crypt. Dimitri protested, warning that removing them would compromise the dome's essential function, but he was overruled. The cables were cut, the hum stopped, and the environment inside the cathedral degraded. The air became noticeably heavier. People began complaining of headaches during long services. The exceptional acoustics became muddled, and the interior stonework began suffering from moisture damage for the first time in decades. This sequence of grounding system removal, followed by environmental degradation inside the building, appears in other fragments of European cathedral records from the same period. Maintenance logs from Notre Dame and financial records from the Basilica of Superga note the removal or simplification of old dome metalwork and fittings in the late 1800s. When a complex system is simplified, it suggests that the people making the decisions no longer understood what the intricate metalwork was designed to do, or they chose to discontinue its function. The timeline of this shift is highly suggestive. The period when grounding systems began to be dismantled or ignored, the years 1870s and 1880s, overlaps precisely with the development of the centralized commercial electric grid. Centralized power generation became the dominant economic model for electrical infrastructure. If decentralized atmospheric electricity collection through existing architectural structures was a competing model, one that did not require fuel, generators, or a paid utility grid, the emerging economic interests had every reason to see the old knowledge fade. Dmitry Volkov tried to pass the knowledge down, explaining it to his son before he passed away in 1889. The great domes of Europe still stand, their copper sheathing and iron frameworks intact, and the heavy-gauge copper cables, green with patina, can still be found running down into the earth or ancient water channels beneath the crypts. What remains missing is the widespread understanding of what it all meant. The structures were beautiful, but they were not just beautiful, they were functional infrastructure, and the last caretakers who knew how to maintain them took the full scope of that knowledge with them when they left.